Thanks for that intro. I'll sign however many pieces of Decemberist memorabilia you like.
That's our mean publicist.
Yeah.
We're nicer than her.
Thanks for coming out. Yeah, my name's Colin, that's Carson. We've written this book, or I've written it and she's illustrated it, The Whiz Mob and the Grenadine Kid. I'm going to read a little bit from it, and then we're going to talk a little bit about... Oh, wow, that's so cool, sorry. Well, I'm going to try not to let that distract me. So I'm going to talk a little. I'm going to read. We're going to talk about a little bit about where it came from, why we made it, and then we'll also take some questions at the end. But before I go into the reading, I should give you a little primer on where this sort of takes off. So this book is set in 1961 in Marseille, France. It centers around the adventures of a kid named Charlie Fisher, who himself is the son of Charles Fisher Sr., who is the American Consul General in Marseille. He's a professional diplomat, and Charlie has traveled around the world with his father from his various posts, and is always very bored with his life. He's a 12-year-old kid. And in Marseille, they've been in Marseille for maybe 6 months, and he has sort of spent his days getting credit for this English tutor, writing short stories while he's sitting in squares in Marseille, sort of people watching and imagining the interior lives of the people that he's watching. And it's on one such day, a Tuesday in April in 1961, that he's in the Place Jean Jaurès in Marseille, doing just that, writing stories in his notepad with his Schiefer Imperial pen that his father gifted him, when he witnesses a pickpocketing, but not just a pickpocketing, not just somebody stealing a wallet, but kind of this extraordinary, obviously choreographed event between five or six different kids in the marketplace, sort of fleecing this guy of his belongings in this really sort of magical way, or seems like sort of this magic trick. And Charlie is really taken by this. It happens that there's a kid who'd sat down next to him, who had taken an interest in his writing, that he kind of turns to share this experience when he witnesses this magical pickpocketing, and this kid is gone. He doesn't think much of it until he turns to write in his notepad again, when he realizes the pen that he was holding in his hand is now gone, and it's been replaced with a stick. So clearly, this kid has sort of been in league with the pickpockets and has done sort of a magical pickpocketing, a pen picking of his own. He sees the kid run off. He gives chase. The kid is stopped by some police not far off. Charlie provides an alibi for this kid because he's so curious as to how he did this. He gives cover to this kid to the police. He says he gave the pen to the kid in order that he can kind of unlock the secrets that this kid clearly has. So that's a lot to take in. That happens in that section here, probably more efficiently described here than I just did. Anyway, but that's where this begins, and that's where I'll begin reading. The boy's name was Amir, and he hailed from Lebanon, or that was how he introduced himself. He denounced his name and birthplace with the kind of confidence that only invited suspicion. He did not give his last name, and Charlie didn't press him for it. He said he hadn't meant to take the pen, but that he figured Charlie didn't deserve to have his pen taken from him. But after he'd seen Charlie use it and he'd seen the words it had created, he was suddenly very desirous of it, as if it, the pen, were the source of the strange stories that Charlie was creating out of thin air. So I took it, simple as that. They'd walked some blocks off and found the curb of a fountain, a welcome place to sit. Charlie eyed his companion in disbelief, saying, "It doesn't seem very simple. I mean, I had the pen in my hand." I don't know how to tell you. You did have the pen in your hand, yeah, but you were looking off, weren't you? You weren't paying no attention to the pen. But I don't have to be looking at it to know that it's in my hand. The boy made a face, one that suggested that further contradiction would only be impolite. Charlie smiled. Here, give me the pen. The pen? The boy frowned and looked down his chin at the tip of the Schiefer Imperial. It was sticking out of his shirt pocket. I'll give it back, don't worry. The pen and the stick, which Charlie had kept as a souvenir of the theft, transferred possession for the second time that day. Charlie held the pen in his right hand, gripping it as if he were writing. Do it again, he said, nodding down at the stick in the boy's hand. Amir laughed. Well, I can't now, can I? And why not? Well, you're rumbled, so to speak. Rumbled? Asked Charlie. It means you're on to me. You know I'm fixing to pinch it. The boy licked his lips. He had the slightest trace of a beard on his chin, and his two front teeth hung slightly askew in their gums. Very well, said Charlie. I shall act like I don't know. The boy seemed to be open to the idea. He said, do as you were, like when you was writing. Oh, right, said Charlie, producing his notebook from beneath his arm. I'll do that. He opened the book to a clean page and held the pen over it as if he were about to write. He waited, his eyes straying occasionally to the boy who sat by his side. The boy hadn't moved. Well, you've got to write something, said Amir. Oh, said Charlie, okay. He began to write his name, Charles Fish Scritch. A gash of ink scarred the page as Amir reached over and inelegantly yanked the pen out of Charlie's hand. Charlie flinched and glared at his companion. Not like that, he protested. Amir laughed deeply, heartily. That's the easiest way, he said, twisting the pen through his fingers playfully. The clout and lamb like a proper rough tool. And do it for real, the way you did, with the stick. Okay, said Amir as he handed the pen back. For real this time. The pen nib hovered over the paper once again, and Charlie began to write his name. To his great surprise, no ink appeared on the page. The nib scratched against the paper noisily, but left no mark. Charlie studied the pen to confirm that it was not a stick, which it clearly was not. He then glanced over at Amir. Amir was holding the ink cartridge. How did you? Gasped Charlie, now speaking into his chin more than ever. I don't believe it. The boy shrugged as if he could take or leave Charlie's statement. Then don't, he said. Can I have my pen back? Charlie wordlessly handed over the emptied pen shaft. And taking it, Amir unscrewed it and slid the cartridge back in place. Did you know the others? The pickpockets in the market? Asked Charlie after a moment. Maybe, responded the boy. You can tell me, I won't say anything. The boy fiddled with the pen before saying, maybe I ask you a question first. Fair enough, said Charlie. Why didn't you throw me, said Amir. Why didn't I, what? The boy clarified. Why'd you cover for me back there with the police? I was curious, Charlie replied, and you seem like a nice kid. You didn't deserve to be arrested. You didn't know that then. I had a hunch, said Charlie, smiling. Maybe you were too nice, Charlie Fisher, said Amir. Maybe you don't read people that good. I think I'm a pretty decent judge. I stole from you. That makes me a criminal. But you're a different kind. You can do something that not a lot of people can do. Amir shrugged indifferently. Teach me, said Charlie. Teach me to do what you do. The boy whistled between his teeth and shook his head. I cannot, Charlie Fisher Jr., I am very sorry to say. We're from two different places, you and me. You're from the straight world, I'm a tool, it don't mix. A tool? A cannon, a tout, on the whiz. Still not following. A pickpocket, Charlie. I'm a thief. You were a good American kid, a writer of stories. I think you should stay that way. Charlie was undeterred. Then maybe, he said, puffing out his chest, maybe that is my pen after all. Perhaps I got my story mixed up with the police back there. You wouldn't, said Amir. I would, said Charlie. Two policemen could be seen some yards away directing traffic on a busy avenue. Those two seem like they might be sympathetic. Silence reigned between them for a brief moment as the two boys locked eyes. The clatter of the Marseillaise streets dinned around them. Amir continued to flip the pen between his agile fingers. You put me in a tight spot, said Amir, finally. He licked his lips and winced. Very tight spot. Charlie shrugged. Come on, he said. I'll think about it, said the boy in blue jeans, after a moment longer. Where? When? Chirped Charlie, barely letting Amir finish. Amir shook his head disapprovingly. This isn't the usual thing. I have to see. I have to make sure. How about this? Tomorrow, I'll come to your house. I'll show you then, okay? Okay, said Charlie. And he stuck out his hand to solemnize the deal. Amir shook it gamely. He then stood up and slipped his new pen into the pocket of his jeans. Thank you again for the gift, Charlie Fisher, he said, bowing formally. Till we meet again. A streetcar, bursting with riders, clattered down its tracks on Cour Belsance, and Amir ran to catch it. Leaping onto the sideboards and locking an arm around the railing, the boy turned and gave a final wave to Charlie before the tram rolled out of view. Charlie watched him go, awed at the deftness of his every movement. If only he, Charlie, was gifted with such grace, he thought. If only he could enjoy that sort of easy confidence, what would such a life be like? But no, he was Charlie Fisher Jr., the friendless American, the scribbler of Avenue du Prado, which made Charlie realize something. Wait, he called after the long-gone streetcar. You don't know where I live. And of course, that's not the last that we see of Amir, as you might guess. Where's the clicker thing?
It's here.
Oh, you got it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll let you handle this bit then. But he does fall in with the whiz mob, and the whiz mob is pickpocket argot for a gang of pickpockets. And we will introduce them to you now. You met Amir here, and that's him from that scene. This is Bora the bear. He's from Russia, Soviet Russia. This is Jackie. She's actually from Chattanooga. This is Michiko from Japan. This is Sembine and Fatur, and they are from Senegal. They are twins. We have Argentine Pluto with his eye patch, and there's a story of how he earns that eye patch. And last but not least, this is Molly the mouse, and she's from the East London. So that's the whiz mob who Charlie falls in with. And this whole story, this whole book kind of came from another book that shares a fairly similar title. And it's this.
How am I doing? Do you want the clicker?
No, it's fine. I feel like I'm using the force.
Okay, it's good. We're kind of telepathic.
You know well enough. Yeah, I'll just
do.
look at you and go like this.
Yeah, whenever you glare at me, I'll know.
And this is David Marr. This was written in 1955. This is called Whiz Mob, a correlation of the technical argot of pickpockets with their behavior pattern. I like to think my title is a little bit better. But it's a really fascinating book, and I would recommend it. It's fairly dry. It is basically a lexicon, I think intended for, I don't know, psychiatrists, police, detectives, to sort of allow them to interpret the slang that was being used at the time in 1955 among pickpockets. And it was a very intricate and involved slang or argot or lingo. It not only talks about their slang, but of their organization, the fact that there, everybody in a whiz mob has sort of principal roles. You have, every whiz mob would have a hook and a cannon and a stall or a steer. You have a duke. And so it's this really rich language and organization. It was fascinating to me. I learned about this book reading a profile about a guy named Apollo Robbins, who himself is a professional tout or pickpocket, but he works in Vegas. He is sort of a magician, not a professional criminal. And he does a show in Vegas where people come on stage and he basically steals their watch off their wrist and their glasses off their face without them knowing it. And I read a profile, it was in the New Yorker, and not only was he really good at what he does, but he's also a student of the tradition of pickpocketing. So I didn't really know that there was one. About the lingo and about their organization, and he talked about this book a lot. The profile also makes mention of a thing called the School of Seven Bells, which is supposedly a school that's in the mountains of Colombia, South America, where one learns to be a real professional pickpocket. And the reason it's called the School of Seven Bells is because the final exam that any graduating pickpocket faces is basically in an exam room a dummy or a mannequin dressed in a full suit with 7 pockets numbered 1 through 7 with a bell hanging from each of the pockets, and a coin has been set into each of these pockets, the expectation being that the pickpocket will pick each pocket, successfully take the coin without ringing a bell, and then if you ring a bell you fail. And that's obviously totally real. But it immediately after learning about the language, learning about the organization, learning about the School of Seven Bells, it just got sort of my imagination firing. And this story, I feel, just kind of came out all in one shot. A young American kid in some country outside of America, some city where he would fall in with a whiz mob sent out from the School of Seven Bells. So really the question at that point, having the plot there, it was just a question, what city would Charlie Fisher find himself in? And I figured since you have the pick of the litter, really, it could kind of work anywhere. It was just a question of picking a city that would be fun to research. And so we chose Marseille, France.
There it is, Marseille, France.
1961.
Right, because if we're going to set a book in such a specific place and such a specific time, we have to get to know it by taking a research trip, which is also known as a fabulous Mediterranean vacation.
Is it weird that I'm going to stay over here because I get to see
it's
the
okay.
slides. It's all right?
You could join me, but it's okay. I'm fine.
You're all right. You can stay. I don't know. Maybe I'll come and join you in a bit.
Yeah, just do your thing,
Okay.
wherever you're happy. So I had been to Marseille when I was in my 20s. I went to a tiny art school for a semester in the south of France, and we took a field trip there. And I was so taken with this city. Has anybody here been to Marseille? One person in the back. Oh, hi. I didn't know. So most people know about Paris. Not as many people know much about Marseille. It's a huge city. It's the second biggest city in France. It's on the Mediterranean. It's very ancient. And it also has a very seedy reputation. So it was sort of the perfect place to set this book and vacation to. So we went. This is us. Except did we say we're married? We're married.
We're married. You guys know that? We're married.
We're married. So we have kids that we packed into those blue suitcases and then unpacked them here at the Chateau d'If. I know, they're cute. They're Milo and Hank.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's them.
So we spent a week in Marseille, just sort of wandering around, getting a general feel for the place. For a moment, I had considered, do I really need to go to Marseille? I mean, I probably could just look at some maps and some, Wikipedia and make it up. But I I can't imagine having made the book without spending time there. It not only is it's an incredible city, but there are little pockets and neighborhoods and just a way that the city is laid out that I think really helped sort of craft the book as I went. And we walked around, we took a lot of pictures. This is the Panier, which is a very old neighborhood just in the north, on the north side of the old port, which is the sort of city center. And it's an incredible old neighborhood. It is like a warren of, twisting maze-like alleyways and apartment buildings crammed together. And to my mind, is sort of the ideal place if you were a pickpocket to have your hideout. So that features prominently in the book. The Vallon des Eaux is a small, kind of like a mini old port. So the city is based around a very large port called the Old Port, and then this is just south of it, and this figures into the book as well. This is a doorway, Chateau d'If. Nothing takes place in Chateau d'If in the book, but it's a cool
It's
photo.
just really cool.
And this is on the Avenue du Prado, which you talk about here. This is the neighborhood where Charlie and his family live, he and his dad. And it's sort of a classic, like, old, opulent address to have, in Marseille. Certainly in 1961 it was, and it is lined with these very old and beautiful houses. And maybe this is Charlie's house. And then Carson took a lot of pictures of doors.
I did. I took a lot of pictures of doors. Because, of course, if the book is going to be set in Marseille, I have to figure out, walking around that city, what makes it distinctively Marseillaise, what makes it look different than Nashville or even Paris or Portland, Oregon. So like the tiniest, most subtle differences that can differentiate architecture in one city from another. And doors are certainly a part of it. So lots of pictures of doors, which I thought were really beautiful. The doors there were all really wooden and kind of taller and skinnier than doors elsewhere, maybe because the buildings there were also very tall and skinny, and they had mail slots and iron grating. So this was the kind of stuff I was taking notice of as we were walking around. And of course, like Colin said, we tried to visit all the kind of important landmarks and the touristy places and the beautiful places, but we also had to visit the normal places. This is just kind of a normal Marseille square. I don't remember what it's called. But I had a lot of pictures like that and pictures like this to remind myself of the funny juxtaposition between these uber-modern apartment buildings and the ancient centuries-old architecture around them, because a lot of Marseille was destroyed during World War II, and people rebuilt in the 50s and 60s when there was like a modernist craze there. And that is a distinctive feature of the city, which is really striking, and I wanted it to make its way into the book. And I did a lot of drawing while I was there. Are there people in here that like to draw? Good. Are there people in here that are illustrators or aspiring illustrators? Awesome, my people. So I love to draw when I'm traveling, and I really love to draw architecture. And I just camped out on a curb across the street from this place and spent an hour drawing it to remind myself what a beautiful kind of set of apartment buildings look like there. And I drew this window to remind myself what windows were like. They all had these simply constructed little flower boxes with succulent type plants in them, and the buildings all had these lanterns on the side. Because this city is so old, and lots of it is medieval, some of it dates back even farther. The buildings are added onto each other in these incredible ways and at these impossible angles, and it was very beautiful to me, so I was kind of trying to capture that in the book too. So this was another sketch I made to remind myself of that feature.
And that says au velours. Oh, my pronunciation is like
That was good the second time.
Voleur. Does anybody know what that means? You do. Thief, yeah.
Yeah, thief.
Right. And that's what you would yell if you were pickpocketed in France. So keep that in mind next time you're there. And we talked a lot about what research would go into making this book, and we figured one piece of research would be to actually be pickpocketed. But
This was Colin's idea.
That was mine.
I didn't agree that this was a good idea.
But I didn't know how to. Having never been pickpocketed, I didn't know how to invite pickpocketing, and I sort of imagined, stuffing a wallet full of cash and having it kind of jut out of my back pocket and like walk around a square, acting like a kind of a drowsy tourist. But that seemed that might invite the next worst thing, like you would get stabbed or something. But Carson did end up getting pickpocketed, so that was all solved for us.
I did. Do you guys want to hear the story? I didn't get stabbed, and actually it has a happy ending. So if you're a mother sitting next to your child right now and you're like, I don't know, it's okay. It's mostly kid appropriate. So I was walking down the street in Marseille, and I was by myself. I was going to meet Colin. He was a couple blocks away. And I was a drowsy tourist with stuff falling out of my pockets. I had like a big dress with a pocket with my phone in it. And someone brushed very close by me, brushed into me on the side and jammed his hand into my pocket. And I thought it might be Colin because he had been practicing some pickpocket moves on me. So I turned to the person to be like, ha ha, and it was a total stranger. And with my lightning reflexes, I grabbed him. I grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. And I didn't let him go until he gave me back my phone. And then with my other hand, once he had given me back my phone, I punched him super hard in the shoulder, and then I let him go. And I watched him walk down the street. And then with my shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and I took his picture because I wanted... Do you see him? He's looking back like, whoa, that girl's tough. I should not have messed with her.
He wasn't a very good pickpocket.
He was a terrible pickpocket.
So you call him a rough tool.
Yeah, I actually felt like that may have been the first time he had ever pickpocketed. I felt a little sorry for him. I was like, don't give up. Maybe next time. Maybe next time you'll do better.
Yeah, so we had our characters. I feel like I had my story, I had the setting. It was just a question of when. And just decided to go with 1961 for a bunch of reasons. One, it was, within, the time span that the David Marrer book, probably was still in use, that Argo, from 1955. Also, it's, pre-digital age, everything was done in cash and gold. So people were walking around with a lot of cash and jewelry, men with fancy watches. Didn't have locked iPhones, and also there was lots of pockets to choose from, because men in particular, wore suits a lot more often, or it was more common then. And this is a drawing from the book that Carson did of, sort of a typical Marseillaise gentleman, wearing a suit with a overcoat with the pockets labeled in the pickpocket argot. So the interior pocket of your jacket would be called a coat pit. If you were wearing an overcoat, it would be called a tog. That would also have a tog pit, an interior pocket. And the jacket would have a coat tail, which is a front pocket. Vest would have a vest jerve. There'd also be a coat jerve. A coat jerve is a horizontal cut pocket just above the coat tail, and that would also be called the ticket pocket, which would be helpful to know if you were a pickpocket wanting to get somewhere. It's where you would keep your bus ticket or your tram ticket or your plane ticket. Then you had your trousers, your pants, and those, of course, would have pockets, your left and right front breech kicks, and then your rear pockets would be your left and right keister kicks. So that's some of the pockets that are in the pickpocket argot, and so that you're not totally lost, we do provide a glossary in the back of the book, because I wanted this book to be as sort of rich with this pickpocket slang as I could cram in there.
It's actually 2 pages of a 5-page glossary. There is a lot of language to learn in this book.
And then it was just a question of like getting into the world of 1961 Marseille. And, you know, writing Wildwood was a completely different dilemma, you know, because it was set in current times and I lived in Portland, so that was fairly easy to research. This one, not so much, since I didn't have a time machine. I had to go with the source materials, and this is a Michelin guide from 1960, which is all in French, but was really helpful of, you know, looking at maps of Marseille and the various restaurants and hotels that would be in the city center in 1960. I also read a lot of books that were written at that time. This is Black Docker by Sembine Ousmane. He was a Senegalese writer living in Marseille, and it was really helpful. It talks a lot about the sort of the geographical layout, the neighborhoods in Marseille, and the sort of the class schisms in those neighborhoods. So that was really helpful. Zazie in the Metro. Has anybody read this? Yeah. This is a fantastic book that I learned about just researching, like, what book should I read about early 60s France, late 50s France, and this came up. And this is an amazing, amazing book, and it's sort of the day in the life of this anarchic character, Zazie, is this kid and her family, and their day in the life, and it's totally amazing, really absurdist and weird, and it's really fun. And I really wanted the kids in this book to have some of Zazie's spirit. Of course, On Leave, Daniel Anselm is about a soldier on leave, a French soldier on leave from the Algerian War. The Algerian War was just coming to an end in 1961. And while it doesn't figure a ton into this book, there's just a brief mention of it. It felt like it would be important to read this because it was, certainly in Marseille, it was in the Mediterranean, the topic of the day. So it felt really important to get into that a little bit. And then, of course, read The Count of Monte Cristo, Alexandre Dumas. Count of Monte Cristo is set in Marseille. And in fact, Edmond Dantes escapes from the island prison of Chateau d'If, where you saw our kids earlier. And while this was written, 200 years prior to this book even taking place, it felt so important to that area, to that region, the history of it, that I couldn't write a book about Marseille without having read it. I read it aloud over the course of a year to my 10-year-old son. It is something like 1,600 pages long. And I've sprinkled a lot of little Count of Monte Cristo Easter eggs into the book, so you can, if there's any fans out there, you can dig around for those. Of course, Marcel Pagnol's fantastic trilogy of plays that became films, Marius, Fanny, and César, are set in Marseille and kind of revolve around a family that owns a bar on the old port that actually is still there. It's called the Bar De La Moran.
Right, we visited this bar, the Bar De La Moran, which is, as you can see from this photo, very weird and beautiful. And went there and took pictures. This is what it looks like from the outside. And Colin actually set a scene in the book at this bar, so I was able to use my photos to draw the bar in the book. So that's a scene at the Bar De La Moran, which actually exists with a mirror in the background.
Also, I had a good excuse to dig into French New Wave films, which was great. And this one was obviously helpful in many ways. Not only was it to take place around the time of this book, but it's also about pickpockets. It's much darker than my book, but it still was really an amazing film. As well as Rafifi, a great heist movie. I wanted this book to have a feel of a classic heist, and so this is a great example of one of those. 400 Blows, Truffaut. These are just a few of the ones I feel like we dug into. This was really helpful, just kind of looking at the interior lives of children, of a kid in France in the early 60s. And then Mon Oncle, was a great film too. Carson used it a lot for the look and feel. Like you talk a little bit about the juxtaposition of modern architecture and all, and this I feel like this film is sort of about that.
Yeah, I think it is about that. It stars Jacques Tati as Monsieur Hulot, who's like this bumbling, scatterbrained, silly, ridiculous uncle. Mon oncle means my uncle. And the relationship between him and his nephew, but also the relationship between him and his sister and brother-in-law. And he's kind of from the old France, and they are like these obsessed modernists. And I just thought this movie was so beautiful. This is the apartment building that he lives in. And so I thought I watched it a lot to get ideas about tone and architecture. It's not set in Marseille, but it is set in France around the time that our book is set. And I used it a lot because there's a lot of kids in it. So I used it a lot to get a sense of what kids dressed like then, because obviously they don't dress like they do now, but it's not like Oliver Twist. You know, they don't dress that differently either. The differences are more subtle. It's like the cut of a pair of jeans, and they wore jeans and sneakers and t-shirts, but they all looked a little different. So I spent a lot of time like pausing the movie to look very closely at how people were dressed. And I really spent a lot of time with this movie, so I felt like I had to fit them into the book somehow. That's Monsieur Hulot and his nephew. This is kind of the iconic scene of them on their bike. And so I put them into this big Marseille panorama. You see them? And there's another thing in this illustration that I've shown you guys before too. It's this little stretch of apartment buildings, which I showed you that thing that I drew when I was sitting on a curb. So that's how it made its way into the story. This is what the original drawing in my sketchbook looked like. It didn't always have scrawling on it, but I have a 4-year-old who likes to decorate my art. That's like Spider-Man crawling up the side of the building, I think.
3 at the time?
Yeah, he was earlier then. Now there's progress been made.
Spider-Men are a lot better now.
They're so much better now.
Spider-Men, Spider-Mans are much better.
Spider people. Yeah, and also now he asks me before he draws all over my drawings. It's progress. So other ways that source or reference material made its way into the illustrations, like I said, I took a lot of pictures. Here's another amazing weird building. It's like a church and an apartment building and a store, and it's all kind of jumbled together and from lots of different eras. And I thought it was beautiful, so I took a picture. That's Colin in the middle in his jaunty Mediterranean straw hat. And then I used it actually as the hideout for the pickpockets, for the whiz mob. This is their scatter. That's a hideout in pickpocket speak. And this is Charlie coming upon it for the first time in this desolate square in the Panier. Here is a war monument along La Corniche, which is a big boulevard that wraps around the coast in Marseille. And we visited there too. And I took a picture, and Colin used it as a setting in the book, and then I was able to use my picture to make this illustration of a wedding party being photographed in front of it while Charlie and Amir steal one of their cars. They leave a note and they return it, just so you know. And then I was just going to briefly talk about, the last thing I'm going to talk about is why I chose the medium I chose and what the inspiration was there. I'm an illustrator of lots of books, and I did the art for this book in pencil, which is I'd never done before. I've done art in pen and ink and gouache and watercolor and ink, but I'd never used pencil. These are all books I've illustrated. The 2 on the top I wrote also, and the ones on the bottom Colin wrote and I illustrated, and the art for them is all done in gouache and pen and ink. Gouache is a lot like watercolor. It's a paint that you water down with water, and it can be opaque or translucent. It's my favorite, and it's been a staple of children's book illustrators for years and years. It's a great, super adaptable medium, but for whatever reason, I didn't really want to use it for this book. I felt like it called for something different. These are some of the illustrations when they're hanging up in my studio. You can see they're just little pencil drawings on paper. Nothing fancy. And the reason why I went kind of the nothing fancy route was because in the 50s and 60s and the mid-century, you know, I'm a huge fan of children's literature and especially children's book illustration. I have been since I was a teenager, so I'm kind of a student of it. And when I knew that the book was going to be set in 1961, when I think of that era, I think of line art. I think of pen and ink. I think of pencil. I think of stuff like this. Do you guys know who this is? Eloise. She lives at the plaza. I think that a lot of the reason behind that is, it was a stylistic thing, but there were also different kind of production and printing constraints than we have now. So obviously printing in black and white or printing in black and white with a single color was a lot easier than printing full color paintings. Maurice Sendak was doing a lot of pen and ink work then. Pauline Baines, this is earlier, of course. This is from the Narnia Chronicles, but she influences everything I do, and I think she's such a master of line art. And then this is by Ben Shawn, who's my very favorite artist, who didn't actually do that many kids' books. I think he only did one, and he illustrated a couple others. He was an illustrator, he was a fine artist, he was a photographer, he was an activist. He's just a hero of the early part of the century, art hero. And what I love about this drawing is that it's so simple. He's used so few lines in it, but he's just like a perfect composition. He's sort of captured everything he needs to capture, and he's using these big dark spaces to kind of draw you in and to anchor the illustration. So I was thinking a lot about him and about this kind of drawing when I did the art for the book. So I chose pencil because it seemed a little more loose and flexible than pen and ink. I'm a very stiff drawer. I have a hard time loosening up, but I thought pencil would help. And I used like thousands of pencils. This was a little handful of them. And actually, that's the end of our presentation.
But we'd love to take questions if you have any. And I'm going to move over to the chair now.
Come, join me.
For
Come
the
sit with me.
part.
Does anybody have any questions? With the red right there.
Yeah, sorry. My hand popped up because I also thought of Edward Gorey.
Right, Edward Gorey. You know who else I thought of today is Shel Silverstein, which, those books of poems that we're so familiar with are a little bit later, but The Giving Tree is right around this time. I think it's like mid-60s or something. But there's a lot of examples of it. People got so good at line art back then.
Yeah.
Wildwood Trilogy is set in Portland, which is where you guys are from, and then you have Marseille, which you were as familiar with, had to do research for Wisma. So which method do you prefer, I guess? The more familiar territory or doing more research, traveling more?
Oh man, that's a good question. I mean, they felt very different. I mean, the Wildwood books, I felt like I could just kind of onto the page a little bit more. But with Wismob, I couldn't. I knew that if I blawed too much, it would pull it out of its place, and that was really part of the appealing part of working on the book is to have it feel as best as I possibly could as a person who lives in 2017 America. Feel as if you were reading this if you had lived in Marseille in 1961. It would look at least familiar, and I know it's not going to be like I had a video camera that I could go back and film it. And which I prefer, I don't know. Researching a book this is the first time I'd ever done it. I'm a fan of historical fiction, like Hilary Mantel is a hero of mine. I know that she, when I've read interviews, she talks about literally boxes of source material, of documents that she's collected just surrounding her desk. And I was like, oh my God, is that what I'm going to have to do? I'm a fan of that process, and I think I dipped my toe in it, and that was probably as far as I would be willing. But in the end, it felt really good. It felt like once you had really immersed yourself in that world, you could kind of move a little faster. You didn't feel as if you were so confined. You started to feel that you knew how the streets were, you knew how people talked, or you knew what they were wearing because you had spent enough time reading about this stuff. And I think I did, probably a fraction of what somebody like Mantel would do, but Yeah, it was great. It was fun. So I don't know what I'd prefer. It's a lot of work. They're both a lot of work. Okay, that's the end of the question.
I'm curious about your personal creative disciplines.
Personal creative disciplines. I think we're actually pretty disciplined in general, especially because we have kids. We've known each other a long time, and I would say that our work habits and our work ethic since having kids has changed radically. Mm-hmm. We're very serious about our work day. They go to school and we are working, or at least we're in our studios thinking about working. Which are often the same thing. You know, if you're in that space getting ready to work, you're kind of working because you're not taking a walk or seeing a movie or, you might be looking at Instagram for a long time. But but my personal daily discipline is get the kids off to school and head out to my studio and just spend the day out there. And I'm pretty much out there until they need to be picked up. We each drop one kid at school because they go to 2 different schools, and then we come back and we have our breakfast. We go out to our studios. We alternate picking them up, so one of us gets a little bit of a longer work day while the other is picking up kids.
But it works
Yeah.
out. I mean, we get it done.
We
right?
do get it done, yeah.
I mean, my process, certainly writing these books, I need to lay out a chunk of time. It's really not like writing songs where you can sort of fit that in wherever, or it's more elusive. The day is more fluid. With writing, it's really about get in there and write or edit or do something for 6 hours, or however many hours you can manage. And you get more done the more time you put into it. I mean, you do have to recognize, I feel like I could never put in like an 8-hour day of writing. I think you would just start doing bad things after a certain point. So it's sort of like recognizing what your limit is. And for some people, it's an hour, and some people can go for 10 hours, But I the sweet spot, I think, 6 hours. I'm doing other things during that time. I'm like walking around and staring out the window and playing video games, things like that. But for the most part,
I can't believe you just publicly admitted that. They're
part of my process.
They're even taping this.
It's part of my process.
That's usually like hush hush with Colin. He must really like you guys.
Songwriting, on the other hand, is something that just happens whenever, and I do need to set aside time. It's hard because I feel like it's harder to like reserve that time because it doesn't look like work. It looks like a dude sitting on a couch strumming a guitar and staring into space, which doesn't look like a work. It looks like slacking off and being a stoner or something. And so when you're like, I can't pick up the kids because I have to like sit on the couch and stare into space with a guitar, is a hard sell.
It's kind of a hard sell sometimes, I'll be honest.
But somehow we get it done.
Somehow we do. I also, lately have tried to be more in touch with how working too much is not great. Like, I feel always very frantic about and precious with my studio time because I feel like it's limited because we do have kids. We also live on a farm, so we have kind of this big property that is another big responsibility. But I have, a few months ago, I decided that every Tuesday I was going to take off work to go on a hike, and I've actually done it every week. And I try to garden in the mornings in the summer, just to remind myself that it's not a grind. It's not a thing that I need to just go out there and do every day. I should do the other things I love, so it feels like it feels more of like a holistic part of my day and existence.
Can I ask, expanding on that, how you two work together? Do you write first and then you illustrate, or did you have an outline of a story and you started drawing and you were inspired by her drawings?
With Wildwood, it was much more like that because I feel like I was so new at it. I felt like it was something that we had talked about doing together for such a long time that I felt like we were sort of crafting it together, or crafting the collaboration, because we had never collaborated on books. By the end of the Wildwood books, or the third book in the series, I think we were pretty well established, like how we were working. So I feel like the first Wildwood book, there was a lot of that, like me writing a little bit, showing it to Carson, her doing, character sketches and things like that, and experimenting with mediums and things. With this one, it really, because it didn't feel like the illustrations and the text needed to be, like it wasn't so intensely illustrated, it was much more traditional. Like I wrote the book and handed it over to Carson. Of course, she's my number one sounding board. And so she had to get an earful about all of my, tearing my hair out about the plot points all along, and was very helpful in, and just listening and offering guidance. But other than that, it felt pretty like a traditional author-illustrator relationship, right?
No, not really.
No, it didn't. Never mind. It didn't at all.
A traditional, this is interesting, and I don't know how many people know this. Typically, not that many people know it. But there's not a lot of collaboration traditionally that goes on between authors and illustrators. So most of the time, a manuscript is written by an author. That manuscript gets sold. An editor takes it on and assigns an illustrator to it, and then the illustrator is working with an editor and or an art director. And in most of the books that I've worked on with people I'm not married to, there's no interaction between me and the writer. And often the writer is not seeing, sometimes the writer isn't even seeing sketches, they're just seeing the finished art. It sort of depends on how much they want to be involved. And in some instances, if the writer wants to be involved, they have to really assert themselves. Like it's not a given that they're going to be able to give a ton of feedback to their editor unless they're like, I really feel strongly about this, I want to be involved. So in that way, because we're always talking about it, and because it's like, becomes a part of our family culture when we're working on a book together, and our kids are talking about it, and it's not traditional. But compared to the Wildwood books,
It more resembles.
it more resembled that, in that I was given a manuscript and I just went through and illustrated it as I would another manuscript. But I was able to talk to you about it while I was working on it.
What is your favorite book you've written or illustrated?
Good question.
It's a good question. My favorite is The Whiz Mob of the Grenadine Kid, which is available here. It is. It's if only because you're just trying to give yourself that pat on the back, after having spent so much time working on something. If you were out, a book comes out and you're like, I didn't really like it very much. I think I'm always more fond of the most recent thing I've done. And that may change 2 years from that point. And there's kind of a nice freedom in being able to assess your work. Certainly with records, the thing that was my favorite, I was like, no, actually, that's the worst thing I ever did. But until you get that perspective, you just don't know. For now, it's always the most recent thing, I think. And I really do like this book. I do. I'm not just saying it. What's your favorite?
Well, I love this book so much. But I am very invested in the couple of books that I've written myself, just because they all came from my brain. So I didn't have to think about how to illustrate them. They just sort of came out. So I would say that Do Is Talkin' Home come right after The Whiz Mob and the Grenadine Kid, which is my favorite book that I've illustrated.
It's a favorite book of all time. That's really interesting. That's your favorite book you've ever read or anything?
Yeah, ever.
Oh, wow.
And you're my favorite author.
That's really sweet. Good question. Yeah.
I have a question. I really appreciate you explaining how illustrators typically illustrate when they're not married to the author. So it sounds like the editor will find an illustrator. So how, as an illustrator, do you become one of the people that an editor would pick?
Well, oftentimes a literary agent plays a big role in that, but not necessarily all the time. It is almost exclusively the case with authors. So when authors want to be published, they have a kid's book manuscript that they want published, they typically, if they want to have it published by a big publishing house, they have to get themselves a literary agent. It's less so the case with illustrators, though most illustrators I know do have a literary agent. And you can do that by sending some art to literary agents you like and querying them. So you do it much the way an author would, where You send your portfolio and a letter telling them how much you like the books they work on and stuff like that. But you can also do the same thing with publishers, and you can, one thing people sometimes do or used to do, I think they still do, is to make a promotional postcard and just send it around to any publishers you want to work with. Yes?
Our families really enjoy not only your books, but also Colin's sister's books as well. Can you tell us what either your parents did or didn't do to your creative successes?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, reading was always important in the house, but and my mom didn't have a television, but I wouldn't ascribe that because that was just misery. And also, Miley and I have actually both talked about this, how we missed out on like a big chunk of popular culture and that we couldn't share with friends because we didn't have a television. So I don't know that I would say that, like we didn't have a television, but reading was important. We had a family, my great uncle was an artist, was a painter. My uncles were into photography. I feel like the arts was always sort of around, even though my dad's whole thing was like, if you ever decide to do the arts, only do it as a hobby. Never pick a real job and then do it as a hobby. And that was that. I think he taught, and it was sort of his curse that both of his kids should decide to sort of pursue the arts as their main job.
Well, it's like divine intervention because you proved him wrong.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that was also the cautionary tale of my great uncle, Hank, who taught at Columbia and was a great painter, and who died broke of a heart attack in his mid-50s. I think that also hung over the family as well. But other than that, I don't know what to ascribe it to.
You have great parents and a really cool kind of creative extended family that are smart. And even if your dad didn't encourage you, I think
we had people around.
Yeah.
I guess.
I like them. Yes.
Did you have like a big aha, I want to be an author moment, or was it like, oops, wrote a book, here it is, world?
No, I had an aha author moment when I was a little kid. Like, I think shortly after, realizing that being Batman wasn't a verifiable thing to want to be. I think I wanted to be a singer in a band. No, I wanted to be an author, and then I wanted to be a singer. No, I was a singer in a band first. And then I wanted to be. Those were the two things that I had always wanted to be, and I decided initially that being an author was made a little bit more, was more realistic, and so I was in school for that. So it's been something I've wanted to do for a long time, and the band stuff just kind of took over. Yeah.
There's that amazing letter you wrote. Was it to Ray Bradbury?
Oh yeah.
When you were a little kid, and it's like, I too am an author.
Yeah. I had.
It's a good
big
letter.
ideas. Yeah, like I remember going on a trip with my family and like asking my mom to take my author photos. Like while I was like on the Oregon coast and like standing on a dune. Like looking away. Like I was really into the idea of it. And here we are. Yeah.
So, like, with the main character, like Charlie, how do you keep that character kind of in your mind, like, keep him from changing so much that he's not the same person?
That's that's hard. It's something you don't realize is hard until you've written something that's long, that how these characters can morph and change in a way that they shouldn't. You fall into patterns, or you've written a character all the way through and you go back and the character is totally unrecognizable from what it becomes. And that's something I didn't realize until I was writing things that were longer. I feel like hearing his voice, I feel like I'm still learning, going back to Hilary Mantel, I know that she's talked about she didn't know a character until she invited him into her study. Like, it really involved this sort of imaginary play where she actually invited in this giant. It's the book about the giant where she invites him in and fully imagines then what he was saying to her. So it's not just this thing on the page that you have to, fill in their dialogue in between quotes, but you have to really see this person and hear this person, and that is so hard. So I don't know if I have any advice other than like really listening for them each time they talk, because it's easy to get into sort of autopilot mode where you're just sort of dialogue. But doing your due diligence and making sure that you're hearing them speak every time they speak.
Do you have any advice for aspiring authors or singer-songwriters or illustrators?
For any of those things? You have lots of things. Firemen.
Or llama
Public
farmers,
servants.
or we have a lot of advice for llama farmers.
Don't get llamas. No. I think of all those things, just work. Just write, create, work. That's the very best thing you can do. Sort of, I don't want to say believe in yourself, because that's just, that's terrible. But you should believe in yourself. I mean, you should make a practice. I think that's a really great thing to have, particularly with writing prose. Not so much with writing songs, because songs are a different thing. They exist in a different, sort of in the ether, and getting them involves different kind of stuff. But at least with writing prose, I think, like, set aside an hour just to write. And even if you can't, even if you can just manage to get a sentence out, that's fine. Just write, even if it's awful. It'll get better. And I think songwriting, to a certain degree too, don't get bummed out by your bad songs, because you should write bad songs, because that's the only way you'll know what a good song is when you've written a bad one. I've written a lot of really bad ones. Similarly with writing, making mistakes and just moving on. And the illustration, I don't know, they just draw pictures. I mean,
What do you?
Get a pen, just some paper, I guess.
That's great advice. You're really good at that.
What would you advise?
I would say the exact same thing about developing a practice. That it's like anything else, you don't get good at it unless you do it all the time. I really think that obviously artists need to have kind of a singular way of looking at the world, and if you love to draw, I think people get really hung up on this idea of like coming up with a distinctive style that stands out from all the other styles. But if you have a singular way of looking at the world and you draw all the time, that happens pretty organically, because you are a singular person, you are an individual. And if you draw enough and you're always kind of looking around the world at things that you think are beautiful or interesting or fascinating or you want to draw, and also looking around the world at art that other people are making and kind of absorbing that, and you will come to a way of drawing that is all your own. And that's probably good if you really love to draw. Becoming an illustrator or an artist is only for people who love it so much that they would do it even if there was no one to see it. If you would draw in a void, if you would draw on a desert island, because you're that kind of, you love it and you're passionate about it and you're compulsive about it, then you should definitely just draw every day and pursue it. If you're on the fence, like, yeah, it would be fun to be an artist, but the art making part gets me down, then I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, okay, I'm done. Okay, one more question.
You're in the back.
Have you always been an artist, or like just lately have you not started pursuing different careers?
I have not always been an artist. In fact, I am a late blooming professional illustrator. I've always been an artist in my own mind, and I've always had a artistic or creative practice since I was your age. I was a person who was drawing all the time. So in that sense, I've always been an artist. But I went to a school, kind of always wanted to be an illustrator because I've been really into book illustration always, at least since I was a teenager. And I went to a school with no illustration program in Montana just because I really wanted to move to Montana. I grew up in the suburbs of New York. Maybe I was just drawn there so I could like meet this person. But so I went to a school where I didn't study illustration and there wasn't much of an art program. And I graduated from that school and I was a cocktail waitress for a long time. And then a bartender when things got a little less lame. Bartender was a slightly better job. But I had a lot of bad jobs that I didn't care about before I got to do this for a living. I was 28, I think, when I quit the service industry and started working professionally as an illustrator. And I started very slowly and lived very, very cheaply for a very long time.
Yeah, similarly, I was writing stories when as soon as I was able to write. I wrote a play in second grade called The Bloody Night. That was basically about a medieval night massacre that I'm amazed. We got to give a shout out to teachers who don't freak out when they have creepy kids, with creepy ideas. In fact, we did a school event and it was so awesome. This girl came up to us and was like, I write stories, but sometimes they scare me. And I have murdery thoughts.
And her friends on either side of her were like, yeah, it's true, she does.
and I have this, and I've been, I was like you. I totally had murdery thoughts too. I mean, in this, it's like, fascinated with sort of, kind of, wild and fantastic things. So I was writing a lot. I wrote stories, and then as soon as I learned an instrument, I started writing songs. But nobody even, all through high school and college, when I was in school for English, for literature and creative writing, I was still writing songs. I wasn't playing them for any. I was just sort of writing them because I felt compelled to write them. And then I too had a lot of really terrible jobs, and I was a pizza guy. I worked at a pizza place. When I first moved to Portland and in a bookstore, before I think I quit around 28 too.
Yeah, and we took ourselves out to a steak dinner.
We took to a fancy dinner.
When we quit our day jobs.
So, yeah, I mean, in some sense, that's sort of late blooming. I mean, you think of a lot of people, particularly in music, like getting, let's not go to college and just, take off when you're 19 and join a band, which works for a lot of people. I'm kind of glad that I didn't. Not only did I get to meet her, because I went to college in Montana as well, but that was a great time just to kind of work in a restaurant. Everybody should work in a restaurant. It's such a great life skill, not only learning just cooking, but also just being around other people and working with other people, I think is a really great thing. So even if you're working in a restaurant or a bar, you're still being an artist. It's actually good skills to have. And so I'm thankful. And then being able to kind of launch into my kind of career when I was more of an adult, I think was also a good thing in the end, even though I was like, why is it taking so long?
Yeah, I just have one more thing to say about that, which I think is kind of important, which is that I went to college, like I said, and there wasn't an illustration program, but I did want to be an illustrator, so I graduated and I made a portfolio, and I wasn't sure what to do with it even. I just sort of like brought it to newspapers and was like, I know you hire illustrators, here's some things I do, and I didn't get any jobs or any work doing it. And it took a really long time, and it took finding a medium that was cool and made my art feel more sophisticated maybe to get that work. But it also, I just wasn't, if you go to college for art, if you are studying art or writing in college, to learn to do that and then go out in the world and do it. But in so many cases, and certainly in my case, I won't speak for my husband because I don't know if it's true, but in my case, I wasn't a good enough artist when I graduated college to make a living as an artist. I look at those portfolios I put together when I was 21 and I was like, oh gosh, I wouldn't have hired me either. So I always tell people, like, go easy on yourself. And don't feel bad if you can't figure out a way to make it work right out of college, because you might just have a lot more to learn as an artist. You might have a lot more drawing to do before you're hireable, which is hard to hear, but I know a lot. I mean, I have a friend who didn't start working as an artist until she was in her mid-40s, and now she's like killing it. So just let yourself learn what you need to learn before you go out there and do the thing you want to do.
That's a great place to end it.
Boom.
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.
So I think, I don't know if you have instructions yet for signing line, but
Oh, yeah,
somebody will tell you what to do.
We're
I
going to
assume.
go sign books. We'll see you guys out there, some of you anyway.